Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mike.
So you touched on a bunch of themes in your remarks, and I want to drill down on a couple of them with tying back to some of the discussions we've had earlier today. We had Mary Kay Henry sitting in your seat a little while ago, and you've said in June 21 that workers are the guiding light of trade policy now, and that we need to work to rebuild trust with American workers around trade. And you've talked often about having a worker-centered trade policy. So I'm wondering if you could talk us through what you see as the distinction between a worker-centered trade policy and the sort of more traditional neoliberal approaches that have been pervasive in the past.
Sure. This is such an important question because I think we are faced with so many realities right now that let us know that we need a new approach. And it's how we define that new approach that I think is really an important part of the Biden administration vision. As President Biden likes to say, his vision is that we grow the economy from the bottom up and the middle out. And I always like to watch him do his hand motions because in my mind, he's kind of describing a tree, right? And there's this organic notion of addressing those of us who are close to the ground and driving growth through ordinary people and regular everyday workers. I think that the traditional approaches that we have taken to trade have been about kind of the macro picture. Let's grow the pie. And I think that the pie has gotten much bigger over the last couple decades. But the part that we have not really paid attention to is then what happens to that pie? And the pie gets stuck up here. It's a very, turns out, top-down approach. And so what we are trying to do in this corrective phase of globalization, if you will, is to focus on the individual, the human being, the worker, the community, which forms really the human component of our economy. It's all of us. How can we afford to ignore that benefits need to come to our workers and our people? And so I think that that is the guiding light for us, our workers. It is about creating a trade policy and a trade framework that doesn't continue to pit our industrial manufacturing workers against our agricultural producers, because that's what our traditional trade agreements have done. It's about creating a trade framework that doesn't continue to pit our workers against the workers of our trading partners. And I think that that is, in sum, the vision that we have around building the economy and bringing the worker to the center of everything that we do in trade.
So following up on that, a lot of conversation is always about the what of policy, but let's talk a little bit about the how of policy, because in other forums you've talked a lot about sort of the process of economic policy making and how we make that more inclusive to bring in these workers' voices and other communities who have not necessarily been party to trade conversations. So curious in terms of what have you been promoting so far in the process, and how do you build it in a way that is kind of future-proof, that if and when we ever have another USTR, that these innovations will continue?
Certainly. A lot of it is about setting the table. So one of the reflections I've had in working in trade policy for the past 15 years is, again, in our traditional approach, you generally don't start thinking about how you're going to sell your trade policy until it's pretty much done and baked. And if that's the first time that you're thinking about connecting trade policy to the interests of individuals and workers and communities that make up our great country and our democracy, it's way too late. So at the core of the worker-centered trade policy vision is you've got to start at square one by setting the table and expanding out that table. Another element of it is you have to have more seats at the table, and not just to populate the table, but also really be listening and taking in the additional perspectives that you've invited into that conversation. And so the output in terms of the policy that is formulated necessarily has to look different and should look different. And I think that ultimately that is the proposition that we are bringing in all of our trade initiatives, which is the need to innovate in our trade policies. We love innovation in our technology sector, in our economy, in our creative, inventive people. But we are at a point where our policies, our economic and trade policies, require innovation, because if you look around us, the economy here at home and in the globe around the world is going through something quite unprecedented, very interesting, but strange. And it is the need for that kind of innovation. In terms of how we make this lasting, I think part of the way I look at this is as you invite your stakeholders to the table, and as you build that trust and confidence that their views are valuable and their views are going to shape policy, once you have your stakeholders used to having that seat at the table, they do not give up that seat easily. And so I think that that is certainly a large part of what we are trying to build.
Good. And so, and I want to talk, you've talked about the need for innovation, right, in how we approach trade policy. And you've spoken in the past about sort of turning the page on the old playbook. And I wanted to ask you to go a little bit deeper on there, because I think it's very unusual to see the US Trade Representative calling for things that are not about tariffs, right, or that are about some of the things we've been talking about today. Investing in manufacturing, investing in industrial policy, investing in these sorts of things. So I wonder if you could expand a little bit on some of those calls you've made for sort of the other side of the playbook that has not traditionally been thought about this.
This is also a great question, because it goes to the center of an important part of our diagnosis, which is the fragility in terms of the support and the supportability of our trade policies. Is also a result of US trade policies moving off in a very aggressive trajectory that's been traditionally disconnected from the other things that we do here in our domestic economy. And I think that that distance in terms of the way we think about trade policies as being somehow cabined off from our domestic economic policies has taken us to a particularly fragile and brittle point in where we are. So, on this one, I think that the industrial policy piece, the investing in ourselves piece, is an important part of our correction, that our trade policies can't just be drifting off, moving aggressively in a vacuum, that we have to be looking at it as part of an economic policy toolbox, and that these policies need to be supported by and in turn supporting the economic investments that we are making here at home.
Great. I am told, unfortunately, I've got another 3 questions, so I'm sure the audience has a lot of questions, but I'm told, unfortunately, we need to wrap it up. So thank you so much. Really appreciate these insights.
Thank you so much, Mike. It's wonderful to be here with you. Thank you.